Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Inventory Optimization and Omnichannel Fulfillment, Two Sides of the Retail Success Coin. My name is Chris Cunnane, Research Director at ARC Advisory Group, and I'll be your moderator today. I've been conducting research on omnichannel retail and fulfillment for the last 12 years, and to put that in perspective, when I began my research, it was what we knew as multi-channel at the time. To say that things have come a long way in the last 12 years is a bit of an understatement. Today, what I'm going to do first is go over a few housekeeping items before we get into the discussion. So we will be recording this presentation, so you will have access to it at a later date. And all of our attendees are muted, so we ask that if you have a question, please use the question and answer function in your control panel, and we will answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. The format today is I'll be going over some of my latest survey results on omnichannel fulfillment research. And joining me are Steve Banker from ARC Advisory Group and Scott Fenwick from Manhattan Associates. So I'll give you a little bit of background on each of our panelists, and then we can hop into the discussion. Steve Banker is the Vice President of Supply Chain Solutions at ARC Advisory Group, an industry analyst firm. Steve has been with ARC for 24 years, and in that time, he has covered a variety of supply chain execution and planning solutions. He's also a contributor to Forbes.com and a columnist at Logistics Viewpoints. Steve, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Scott Fenwick is a Senior Director in Manhattan Associates Product Strategy Organization. Scott has been with Manhattan for over 24 years, where he's had product management responsibilities for various inventory, omnichannel, and supply chain solutions. Scott currently has primary responsibility for the product strategy of Manhattan's inventory solutions. Scott, thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here today.
So throughout the webinar, I will be referencing my latest ARC Advisory Group Omnichannel Fulfillment Survey. And just a quick bit of background on the survey, as we compiled the data over the last year or so with a total of 106 respondents that include a good mix of retailers and other direct-to-consumer companies. So as the retail world continues its evolution towards a fully omnichannel environment, one of the biggest issues has always been integration. This slide shows just how disjointed omnichannel integration is. Nearly 3/4 of respondents have not integrated online and brick-and-mortar fulfillment strategies. This generally leads to a siloed approach to omnichannel operations, which ends up hurting both the retailer and the end consumer. In the survey, we asked respondents if they share inventory between sales channels. As you can see from this chart, only 52% are actively sharing inventory, while another 32% plan to add this capability in the next 6 to 12 months. Steve and Scott, I want to put this question to you. Do these results surprise you?
Well, they do. Really, you should be sharing inventory between channels. That is best practice. What folks are trying to do is they're trying to have differentiated service levels. But if you have inventory optimization, you can achieve it. To basically simplify what inventory optimization is, IO takes a forecast, and it takes a variance around the forecast, and it takes lead times, and it applies fancy math and says this is how much inventory you need to hit this this targeted service level. And in the old days, you would do that, for example, at one warehouse, and what was the service level for example, the stores that warehouse fed. So it would be one service level for all products out of one facility. Boy, IO has come a long way. Inventory optimization now is multi-echelon. So you're doing math across all of your warehouses and stores and inventory stocking locations simultaneously. And you can have different service levels by product and by a whole bunch of other things. And omnichannel is something that really needs different service levels. You might say, I want one service level for my stores and a slightly lower level service for e-commerce. Or you might say, these are my A stores, and I want a higher service level for my A stores. or you might say this product is on promotion and I want a higher service level for that. So omnichannel really drives the need for differentiated service levels, but it works better if you have a common pool of inventory.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Steve. I as well am a bit surprised the numbers aren't a bit higher. However, directionally, I would say they're in line with what we've been seeing. You know, early on, there was a big push by retailers to just get started, just get in the game, to turn on Omni, whether that meant pick up in store, ship from store. You know, the goal was let's get some experience and let's get started. And at that point in time, it wasn't entirely uncommon to have, you know, physically separate pools of inventory sometimes. Sometimes, you know, physically separate, you know, facilities for managing e-commerce versus retail. If you fast forward to today, the goal is clearly a single pool of inventory that can be used and repurposed as needed to accomplish the organization's objectives and meet the consumer's needs. Most retailers we work with are working to shift away from the idea of channels. And certainly, while there's lots of new ways to engage consumers, lots of new experiences, mindfully as well as from a system perspective, they're trying to shift away from this idea that these are distinct and different selling channels. The new goal is to better understand consumer adoption of these new experiences as a way to better plan their inventory, as Steve noted, with differentiated service levels and better understanding of demand at much more granular levels, because this is becoming a powerful tool to better control inventory levels and ultimately sales.
To me, the one piece that really jumps out is that 16% that indicated they have no plans to share inventory between channels, but it should be noted that this survey was released before the coronavirus pandemic hit. So I think there's a good chance that number will shrink dramatically as sort of the overall retail environment shifts as well. So obviously sharing inventory across channels is important. And so we asked respondents what the criteria is for using stores for order picking and shipping of e-commerce orders. The top two reasons for using the store are for rush orders and when the DC does not have the items in stock. Do these reasons resonate with you both? And Scott, I'd love to get your perspective on, you know, how does COVID change this dynamic? Steve, let's start with you.
Yeah. So when you when a DC doesn't have inventory available, and so you have to ship from a store again, I mean that's just life, right? No forecast is perfect. Inventory optimization is an extremely powerful tool, but inventory placement is never going to be perfect. And that's why companies need distributed order management solutions. So what distributed order management has is visibility to where all your inventory is at all locations and all the flow paths to deliver something to a customer that are possible. And with distributed order management, you've got built-in contingencies. This is the preferred flow path, but it's not going to work. So we're going to do this, which is the next best way to get it to a customer at a better margin.
Yeah, Chris, you asked about how COVID may change some of this. I think COVID's turned many inventory and demand plan completely upside down. And I do think it's changed, you know, how these results would be approached today. I think a lot of these metrics almost position the store as the backup facility. And as we've seen over the last several months, and as we've seen over the last several years, in all fairness, the stores can be used in a much more strategic way, in new ways to engage consumers, new ways, you know, to build brand loyalty and give the consumers the choice that they want. But I think these numbers perfectly highlight why retailers need to change how they're allocating and replenishing their stores. The pitfall of many supply chain planning approaches that have been used for decades is that they're completely disconnected and often very much unaware of the various fulfillment experiences that are being offered. They typically just don't have that level of detail or level of insight, especially as those strategies change, you know, throughout the course of a year. This practically guarantees that the forecast is going to be off. It's going to be maybe even more wrong than it was before, which means the resulting supply chain planning will be less than optimal. I think it is important to note, though, that if you can get more granular data, and if you can get better alignment between how you're engaging your customers and how you're planning your demand and your supply, then that does give you great ways to leverage the store in new and intelligent manners that I think goes well beyond what some of these use cases starts to articulate.
Now, one of the biggest questions that we always have for retailers and consumer brands is, why are you implementing an omni-channel strategy? So the results of our latest survey are really consistent with what we've seen over the last 5 or 6+ years. Businesses are investing in omni-channel really to increase sales, increase their market share, and improve customer loyalty. So again, as I mentioned earlier, that this survey was completed before the coronavirus pandemic hit. But if anything, the pandemic has increased the need for retailers to develop or further develop these capabilities. So Steve and Scott, what are your thoughts on the reasons behind deploying an omni-channel strategy, and what sort of trends towards e-commerce have you seen during the pandemic?
Well, certainly, I guess I'll back it up a bit. When I look at this, I think I would have had an additional option that people could have selected, and that additional option would have been survival. My very survival depends upon omnichannel. So e-commerce, omnichannel has been growing at a double-digit rate for many years, while traditional brick and mortar has been growing at the less than the rate of inflation. And clearly that rate of growth has gone up. So, every year primarily Amazon is stealing market share from all the traditional brick and mortar players. And to me, and there's whole swaths of retail like department stores that are just going out of business. To me, this is something companies just have to do if they want to remain in business.
I think from my perspective, Chris, I absolutely love this chart, first of all, simply because I think certainly the top 3 reasons that that are cited here certainly align with everything that we've seen in terms of why retailers kind of started down this path to begin with. And certainly, as Steve noted, this is survival, especially in the last several months. But the underlying story, which I think this tells, is maybe even the more important one long term, because it's some of the lower metrics like increased margins, decreased markdowns, improved ability to rebalance inventory. I mean, these are the things that ultimately spell sustainability for the business in terms of financial performance and so forth, which we, as we all know, is going to become critically important. I mean, if you look over the last, unfortunately, what's happened to several retailers over the last several months, as many have struggled to maintain sales because their doors have been closed. It certainly put a lot of undue pressure on the business. And if you kind of fast forward as things start to open back up and business starts to to flow again, those that can do Omni and do it profitably are going to be the the retailers that thrive long term. When you think about how a lot of the original models were implemented, a lot of the supply chain planning models, a lot of those were designed, well before Omni was even a thing, as you noted with some of your history with the research. At some point in a retailer's omnichannel transformation, the economics have to matter. And from what we're hearing from our retail customers, they are becoming, especially as they can, kind of move beyond some of the more current crises, being able to improve margins and decrease markdowns, that becomes critically important. And in order to do that, you've got to refresh the way you think about supply chain planning.
Well, I think your point around the economics need to, make sense definitely is helping to fuel what's going on in omnichannel. And as we look at this slide, this shows how respondents have performed across what we identified as 3 of the key performance metrics. So year-over-year change in revenue, margin, and customer retention. And for me, I think the most important part of looking at this slide is the number of respondents that are seeing double-digit retention rate growth over the last year. Could you explain how distributed order management and inventory optimization are central to revenue, margin, and customer retention?
Yeah, I look at this chart, and I think I'm going to leave the explanation, more of it to Scott, perhaps. But things are getting better for retailers. They're doing omni-channel better. They're making more money at it than they used to. But this is a journey. It takes time. You've got to build a foundation. You need a common WMS for views into inventory at rest. Ideally, you know where you have visibility to inventory in motion. You've got to understand what your costs by different omni-channel flows are. You need a distributed order management system so that if the designated path doesn't work, you've got a good way of getting goods to a customer in a different way. You need inventory accuracy in stores, and you need inventory optimization. So I think I look at this, things are getting better, but Omni is a journey that never ends.
That's certainly my perspective as well, Steve. I think this is where, when you look at some of these metrics, this is where having distributed order management and inventory optimization operating more in unison, where they can really start to make a positive difference for the business. When you think about the role that order management plays in this ecosystem, DOM is the promise maker. Its job is to react when demand when demand and supply do not necessarily neatly align. Its job is to make sure that we can make promises that can be fulfilled to our customers, but do so in the most profitable way. IO's impact, though, starts well before that. It has a significant potential to impact margin if done properly, in that if it can do a better job at understanding where inventory should be dispositioned, there should be fewer times when the order management system is having to redirect orders to locales, whether that's stores or not, that are likely to be more expensive locations to go fulfill, and that has a direct impact on that middle margin number. And frankly, that's where we've seen a lot more attention lately. Slow progress, but a lot more attention lately in terms of trying to improve the overall dividends that these two solutions can pay when they're used in a much more harmonious fashion.
Now, one of the things we've seen change dramatically over the last 5 to 10 years especially is sort of the store's role within omnichannel. So the left side of this slide shows how e-commerce orders are fulfilled. So you can see that a traditional distribution center that also serves e-commerce was the most popular among our survey respondents, but increasingly e-commerce orders are being fulfilled from the store. The right side of this slide shows how retailers are filling e-commerce orders from the store. So 83% of orders are picked and held at the store for customer pickup, 71% are picked and shipped from the store, and 50% are shipped from a warehouse to the store for customer pickup. Do these numbers resonate with what you're both seeing in the industry, and how have you sort of seen the store's role changing?
I'll take a first cut at this. So I think these numbers do certainly resonate and reflect what we're seeing. In my opinion, however, this is where traditional approaches to inventory optimization will absolutely struggle. The traditional inventory optimization models across replenishment as well as allocation, they don't understand the individual complexities that each fulfillment experience potentially brings to the model and brings to the demand. And if we can't understand demand at that level, then those systems and those approaches, cannot optimally disposition supply across the network in advance of the customer actually engaging the brand.
Yeah, as I listen to Scott, I am a big fan of inventory optimization. It has good payback, but there are segments of retail that just haven't felt like it makes any sense for them at all. So if you think about soft goods and you think trying to forecast what's going to be hot, what are the consumer trends going to be? Is it going to be red shoes this year or green dresses or whatever? And you compound that by the fact that a lot of times you're making this stuff in China with very, very long lead times. When we've got forecasting that can't be very accurate, and you've got very long lead times, a lot of folks in those sectors of retail have just decided, we're just gonna have to allocate inventory the best we can, and it's much more in art form than a science.
Yeah, I would agree. Steve. I mean, I think that the concept of inventory optimization has certainly struggled, especially for soft lines apparel, footwear, as you noted. It's been notoriously difficult, largely because in that world, items have very, very short life cycles, and which can be far more challenging, not impossible, but far more challenging to forecast with any accuracy. Therefore, many soft lines goods, retailers have always leveraged these push allocation models, which frankly, in our opinion, are in need of a bit of a fresh approach. Allocators need the same level of insight in alignment with how the business is encouraging consumer experiences. And allocation tools need new methods and purpose-built analytics that ensure the allocators, aren't still simply leveraging stagnant sales plans to make critical inventory disposition decisions. My belief is that inventory optimization can certainly exist for all aspects of your assortment, both short and long life cycle, but certainly some changes need to be made.
There are a variety of capabilities that are essential to a fully omni-channel customer experience. And so, the survey data shows, aside from what stores are doing from an e-commerce fulfillment standpoint, there's also important capabilities such as ordering an item at the store and having it fulfilled from the warehouse, or returning items to the store, even if they were ordered online. What other capabilities should retailers be considering, and how has COVID impacted these capabilities?
I look at this, and you look at these different ways that orders can flow outbound to consumer and inbound from consumer back to a return center. And really this slide, I think, really highlights how very, very important distributed order management is. Distributed order management is how you support these different ways to flow goods, in different ways, forward and reverse. And the one thing I'll say about distributed order management, and Chris, I know you'll agree with this, right? For years, Chris and I asked the major suppliers of distributed order management, provide us references. We want to talk to your customers. We'd like to write about this. And no one ever did. And the assumption I made, and it might have been a wrong assumption, was that distributed order management was just something that was hard to implement. It took too long. It was too customized. It was hard to upgrade. If you wanted to put a different flow in, that became more customization and more headache. And what I'll say is, boy, has distributed order management gotten better. Last year I talked to a customer. It was not a customer in Manhattan that put a variety of distributed order management in very, very quickly. And this year I was listening to Manhattan's online user forum, and the retailer Kendra Scott was able to do a new omni-channel flow path to customers in just 9 days. That's not your daddy's omni-channel.
Absolutely agree, Steve. I also bet that if we took a look at what these numbers look like today, given the COVID reaction, I bet these numbers would look wildly different as well. From my perspective, DOM is and will always be critical to ensure the enterprise can react in real time to optimally match supply and demand, and to do it in the most profitable way. As I said, it is the promise maker, and it will always have a role, because there's always going to be some level of uncertainty in your demand forecast, and the supply plan will never be perfect. However, the next big leap forward is to better align order management with inventory allocation decisions. Again, whether that's a allocation decision or replenishment decision, whatever form of inventory optimization is best for your business, it doesn't necessarily matter. The same concept still needs to apply. Only by ensuring inventory placement decisions are fully aware of and aligned with order management strategies, especially as they change throughout a selling season, that's the only way that the retailer can really hope to achieve these omni experiences for their consumers at the best possible margins. there's also potentially, big missed opportunity for retailers to reduce markdowns. Some Omni experiences actually shift demand away from the DC to the store. In the early days when things like pickup in store were just getting started, there was some piece of your demand from your consumers that shifted from the e-commerce DC down to the store. And there's a fantastic optimization opportunity there if you can measure and understand what that shift looks like, because only by understanding that can you potentially maybe even reduce inventory in the DC, because the e-commerce portion of that total demand has somewhat reduced. But in order to do that, you've got to have the right level of granularity included in your demand planning and therefore your supply planning, as we've been discussing. If you can do this properly, that can ultimately lead to less overstock and future markdowns as well.
So the last piece of the omnichannel experience that I really want to touch upon before we get to the Q&A portion of the presentation is around inventory accuracy. It obviously plays an incredibly important role and can really make or break the omnichannel experience. So looking at store level inventory, it's not surprising to see that it's more accurate at the back of the store than at the front of the store. But looking at these numbers, it definitely surprises me how high a lot of retailers self-reported their inventory accuracy was. Wanted to get both of your thoughts on sort of the importance of inventory accuracy, at the store for omnichannel, but also your thoughts on how these numbers look.
Yeah, they look way too high. I don't believe 17% of retailers have inventory accuracy of 99% at the front of the store. That just doesn't ring true. When I think about it, Chris, we did this survey with DC Velocity, and our database is filled with a whole bunch of supply chain users, as is DC Velocity's, and we don't have store operations people in our database. Neither does DC Velocity. I think the supply chain respondents, just gave this their best guess. It's really store operations that drives inventory accuracy at the store level.
Yeah, I would agree, Steve. These numbers do look suspiciously high for retail stores. Look, store inventory accuracy has always been a challenge, and it's always created challenges for both in-store fulfillment of e-commerce orders and inventory optimization. It creates inefficiencies in the store and potentially bad, expectation setting with consumers. RFID aside, there's just no quick fix. There are processes and things that can be done to improve inventory accuracy, and we have seen a move towards instituting things like receiving and cycle counting and things of that nature within stores, which certainly helps. But fortunately, there are some Omni practices that can actually start to identify and remediate these issues as well. We certainly have seen retailers that, that when a store rejects an order because the inventory was just really not there, systems thought it was there, but it's really not there, then, we can freeze that inventory and maybe even trigger a cycle count for that item so that we can reset the problem. Again, these are types of things that are now possible because we're counting on that inventory for new purposes and have better tools to go institute these things, within the store. But it also highlights another challenge that stems from using store inventory for many different types of consumer fulfillment. The more fulfillment models, the more complex it could get. And consider what happens when an e-commerce order gets routed to a store for fulfillment because the DC was out of stock. Technically there was no lost sale, certainly from a customer perspective. However, in order to properly align true demand signals, there was a lost opportunity if the DC was the most cost-effective, location to fulfill from. In these situations, there's almost a demand realignment that has to happen. The real need today is to forecast true demand based on the fulfillment type and the intended fulfillment model, and then kind of couple that with better store practices to get a better overall view of supply and demand.
Yeah, I think what you bring up about lost sales is interesting, right? So inventory optimization and demand forecasting are really tightly integrated solutions, and that forecasting application can make a forecast that tells an individual store not only this is inventory you need at the store, or what your demand at the store is going to be. But it's also, based on what we're seeing, this is what we think your lost sales are going to be. And so that becomes a powerful impetus for store managers to get out there and fix things, including making sure that they have the right amount of inventory to maximize their sales.
Scott and Steve, I want to thank both of you for sharing your insights with us today. A lot of really, really interesting stuff in there. So at this point, we want to make sure we save time for some questions. And again, if you have a question you'd like to ask, please utilize the the question function in the control panel, and we'll get into as many of those as possible. So it looks like we do have a few in the queue. So let's jump right into those. So first, does the inventory optimization solution use machine learning, and how does that work?
Well, yes. So I mentioned that forecasting and inventory optimization are tightly tied, and the lower the forecast error in the forecasting, the better able you are to hit your inventory service level targets with less inventory. And forecasting is almost the perfect application for machine learning, because every month you make a forecast and we say, we think we're going to sell 1,000 of these, and maybe I sell 900, maybe I sell 1,100, but I've got an instant measure of success on how well I did. And so what the forecasting is able to do is sort of look at these historical forecasts and their error, and say, what if we had made this forecast based on these variables instead of the variables we're making it on? So forecasting is perfect for machine learning, and that means inventory optimization benefits.
We have another question that came in. Using more granular fulfillment data to forecast makes sense, but how can I do this if I don't have historical data at that level of detail?
I can take a shot at that, Chris. Getting the data is the most critical part, of course, and I certainly do realize that a lot of businesses don't retain that data historically for any long period of time. Sometimes, depending on the order management system that you're using, a lot of this history lives in the order management system. It's the system that understands where things were ultimately fulfilled from and where potentially we wanted to fulfill them from. But I think that maybe the critical thing to focus on is to ensure that the solutions or approaches, whatever models you're using for demand forecasting, has the ability and the insight to be able to get down to that level of detail. Because even if this becomes the start of the journey and you truly have no history as a starting point, as long as you start collecting that data, it's just going to get better over time. And as Steve was mentioning, forecasting is rich with data. And the more data that we can throw at it, the better, the algorithms and machine learning are going to perform. So if you truly don't have the data, now's the time to get started collecting it, so that eventually you will be able to get down to the level of detail that's required.
Our next question asks, is the forecasting actually forecasting true demand, or is it just basing forecasts on what is sold? Sales may have been less than they could have been if there was not enough inventory in the store.
Well, that's exactly right. Yeah, it's a little simple. My explanation was a little simplistic because it was based on on sales, which might have been lower than they should have been. And that's, Scott and I both of us talked about what an important tool that being able to forecast lost sales are, and being able to drive action at stores. The way it's done is a little bit complicated. It's probably something we don't want to get into right now.
And looks like we have one final question in the queue. My stores do not have a lot of extra space for storage. Will this approach to supply chain planning just result in more store inventory to contend with?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because that's the physical reality of the situation for a lot of retailers is they just don't have a lot of extra space. However, there's you almost have to separate the concepts that we've been discussing for managing demand and how that gets applied to the supply plan. That's the true inventory optimization aspect of this in my mind. Because no matter what you're doing at the store level, you have to physically constrain the inventory based on the space, based on spoilage. If you're more in the grocery industry, have short shelf life and things of that nature. But again, it kind of starts with, are you building your plan based on how you expect to drive demand or not? And then if you do have to physically constrain the supply plan based on whether it's physical constraints or otherwise, you need to understand what those constraints look like. Because if you can at least understand that, now the business can make some knowledgeable decisions, informed decisions around what opportunities might we be missing on because we just physically don't have the space, for this product, even though we do anticipate, there being more demand than we might be able to have supply for. That could then in turn, trigger more back end questions. Do we have our, mix in the store right? Do we need to allocate more space in the store for different products? I mean, there's lots and lots of kind of back end benefits that could spawn, even though traditionally those are not viewed as inventory optimization, decisions. They're just decisions that could be made better by, better information from the inventory optimization tool set.
Well, Scott and Steve, I want to thank you both for sharing, some really, really wonderful insights with us today. This concludes today's presentation. As I said at the beginning, the recording of the presentation will be made available shortly. So thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.